Springfield, Missouri. We coordinate the labor law series. This is something that has gone virtual during COVID. People like breakfast in St. Louis, lunch. If you have the music on, please turn it off, please. Get the program started. But somebody's playing, big distraction. Thank you. I think I've got to drop the mic now and pass it to you, Mark. I can't the music. So with that, Mark, take it away. I'm fascinated to hear what you have to say on this topic.
All right. Thanks everyone for well, first of all, thank you all for coming, and thanks for Matt and Doug for having me back to do this. When I've done this in the past, I've looked at I've done some kind of presentation that looked at the Missouri economy more broadly, but this time I thought I would share just some information that I've been kind of tinkering with that I think has relevance for some of the workforce challenges that we all currently face. So there we go. In any case, today I'm going to speak a little bit about trends in youth employment. And from an extension perspective, along with kind of Matt and Doug, I'm part of the Business and Communities Extension, which includes our Small Business Development Center and our labor workforce development programs. And so, like, the labor shortage issues are an area of big concern for us. Also, for those of us who don't know, we're within Extension, kind of broadly Missouri Extension. So we also have 4-H. So there's no shortage of kind of internal and external interest in this topic. So today we're going to look to answer several questions to just better understand the issue of youth employment. So the first question is, just a basic question of how many young people are in the workforce and how has that changed over time. Then we're going to look to see, when do young people actually enter the workforce, and what choices do they make when they get out of high school. And then once they've entered the workforce, we're going to look at some information that gives us a sense of kind of what do they actually do when they enter the workforce. And then we'll kind of wrap it up a little bit with how do we help young people enter the workforce, just some steps that we can take to help smooth that process. And then finally, some conclusions at the end of what does this all mean. Now, before, to begin answering these questions, so this is going to be, I'm kind of a data geek by, training and disposition. So, to answer these questions, I've kind of drawn on a bunch of different data sources, the current population survey, and the American Community Survey from the U.S. Census Bureau, along with Missouri's State Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And there's also one more kind of data source that I'll get into, which is called the Quarterly Workforce Indicators, which is developed through a partnership between the Census Bureau and Missouri State Labor Market Information Agency. But before we dive into all that, I just want to also highlight why are we even bothering to talk about youth employment? And I think, we just need to highlight that there's a handful of benefits that go with youth employment. So, from the employer perspective, young people really do provide a source of labor for employers that, are looking to pay kind of, low wages. Maybe it's part-time work, maybe it's seasonal work. And for young people, they can, that's a good source of workers that they can plug into those kinds of jobs. For young people, I think youth employment is it's an important, no matter what that job involves. Even if it's, not the most sophisticated of work, it actually just introduces young people to the world of work. And so it's a good experience of learning how to, to show up on work on time, to, work with people that you don't know who come from all different backgrounds. And so it's a good experience that way. And then in some instances, youth employment can also help, young people get into some career exploration and explore some potential career options, and then, prepare themselves for the future. So I think it's a really kind of an important element when we think about the workforce, and then we think about the future of our workforce, that, this is kind of the beginning of that pipeline as we move people into the labor force that we need to be mindful of. So with that as a starting point, we just start very broadly. And we need to think about just how many young people are in the workforce and how this has changed over time, kind of both over the kind of tumultuous past couple years, which have not necessarily been normal, But I think that's a bit of an understatement. But also over the course of just the past couple decades, because there's some longer term trends that are at work right now in the country. So we're just going to start by looking at the people. And so what the chart that I'm showing here is it's just a population pyramid for the state of Missouri, and it shows kind of two different things. The colored bars, so the blue and the pink bars, basically show our population in 2020, like where we are right now, and then the black bars where there's no fill basically shows where the population was in 2010. So basically it's like how is the population changed over the course of the past decade. So I am personally of the mindset that a lot of these demographic shifts that we're seeing are one of the kind of the big driving forces in changing just what the workforce looks like. We hear all about labor shortages, but a lot of that I think is really feeling the bite of some of these shifts that we know have been coming, the retirement of the baby boomers, for instance. And so when we look at this population pyramid, one of the things that if we kind of shoot our eyes up to we know that the youngest baby boomers right now are in their late 50s. So there's a lot more older folks now than there were 10 years before. So not only we have kind of people hear about the Great Resignation, but really for many boomers, the pandemic has been the Great Retirement as well. And you can see that shift where 10 years ago, there was a lot more people that were between the ages of 45 and 54, for instance. And now a lot of those folks are kind of moving into that either retirement or kind of that pre-retirement age. As you go down, you can see between ages 40 and 55, so it's Generation X. We can see that there's currently there's a lot fewer people now than there were 10 years ago. And I just want to highlight Gen X just because we often get forgotten. So we're used to it though, but that's okay. But we get forgotten, so I just thought we should mention that we're here. Because then, the next thing we think about are the millennial generation. And, for a long time, people think about the millennials as, oh, they're the kids. Well, guess what? They're not the kids anymore. The millennials are now essentially your workforce. They're now, 25 to 40. And we can see that they are fully into the workforce. So, the overall challenge that we're facing is that baby boomers are leaving the workforce. The millennial generation is fully in the workforce. And as we look forward, we think about today's, current young people, you can see that Gen Z, which is age, 10 to 25 or so, there are just fewer people in those ages than a decade ago. So they're not, so we're not going to see necessarily any kind of growth in the workforce anytime in the near future, just from kind of demographics. So what do these demographic shifts mean for the workforce? Well, there's two factors kind of at play. As I just mentioned, there are now fewer young people available to work, but labor force participation rates amongst young people has also declined just over kind of a 10-year period. At least as we think about this in terms of pre-pandemic periods, because that's what we have data from the American Community Survey for. And so if you can look at like labor force participation in Missouri is higher in Missouri than it is for the nation. So that's a good thing. But toward the second half of the past decade, labor force participation went down just as it did nationwide. And so, add in these kind of fewer numbers of young people, and we see some declines, in younger workers. That if you do the math, basically between 2006 and 2010, Missouri's labor force averaged about 168,000 workers, age 16 to 19 or so. But then 10 years later, between 2016 and 2020, the size of this age cohort fell to 143,000. So that's about a 15% drop in a decade's time. So like when all is said and done, there's 24,000 fewer young people in the Missouri workforce than there was a decade prior. So really, if you're looking for just one takeaway from all of this, is that one of the reasons why it's so hard to find younger people is because there are fewer young people to find. So just smaller in numbers. Now, a lot of the data that I just kind of showed, come from the period leading into the pandemic. And as we know, the pandemic just kind of took everything and like shook it and kind of messed it up. But we're lucky in the sense that the current population survey can give us more current information, at least at a national level. And so, as you might imagine, so the chart the chart that you see here is just an index basically of how has the number of young people employed within the United States changed since January of 2020, so just before the pandemic. And basically, we set all those levels to 100 and then see how they change over kind of where they are relative to January of 2020. And if you look at the lines that, the different color lines there, workers age 16 to 17 is the red line, the purple line is 16 to 19, the green is 16 to 24, blue is 18 to 19. And then the black line, importantly, the black line is basically the whole workforce. Now, the pandemic was hard for younger workers for a number of reasons, and probably the biggest, you can see the decline. I mean, like basically 40% of youth employment kind of disappeared in that, that month or 2 months right after the pandemic. In a large part, this is because the types of industries that those types of workers that young people tend to work in, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But it has been recovering basically since then. And then we can see that youth employment, particularly in that 16 to 17-year-olds, more so than the 18 to 19-year-olds, have really taken off, especially in the latter half of 2021. And it's now, the number of people now is kind of 10% more than where it was in January of 2020. And as recently as the last couple months was almost 20% higher. So it's been like one of the, kind of the success stories of the recovery is the, more young people kind of coming back in. At least that's what, certainly within the last 8 to 10 months, that's what the data are showing. However, those are only the recent trends. That's only the last 2 years. And it's important to understand that some of these trends in their bigger kind of greater context. So if we take a longer look back, we can see that even though youth employment has really recently rebounded, particularly those 16 to 17-year-olds in the U.S., it's still 20% lower than it was 20 years ago, right? We're still down, from 2000. And looking backwards, the Great Recession certainly took a toll on youth employment. We can see the big decline that happened during the Great Recession. And then, if we think about, thinking about our generations, 1996 is the last kind of year of the millennials. So the last 16 to 17-year-olds in the millennial generation came through in around 2012 and 2013, so somewhere in here. And so we can see after that, we can see steadier growth in youth employment numbers as Generation Z moves into the workforce. And this is in spite of smaller numbers, which is why they're not likely to get all the way back to the 2000 era numbers when the millennial generation was kind of fully entering the workforce. The 1980 being the beginning of the millennial generation. But again, the bigger takeaway here is that like we're still down from where we were, and again, it's just because we have fewer people. So while the current population survey gives us more current national numbers, it doesn't necessarily provide us with the details at the state level, which is, I think, more relevant for us. So this is where we can turn to a data source called the Quarterly Workforce Indicators to give us some more similar information. Now, I'm assuming this isn't an audience of data nerds, so in case you were curious, the Quarterly Workforce Indicators is a data product that's jointly produced by the Census Bureau and the State Labor Market Information Agency and state labor market information agencies. In Missouri, that's MERIC, the Missouri Economic Research and Information Center, which is now part of the Department of Higher Ed and Workforce Development. And what this data source does is it connects people people's employment records, so their UI records, to their social security number, so you can get a sense of the characteristics of people working in different industries. And in this instance, we care about age. And so what this, the chart that's here shows is an index of employment that goes back to 2000 for workers age 14 to 18 and workers age 19 to 21. Those are the kind of the age cohorts that that this data set gives us. So again, slightly different from the current population survey, which I showed before. So it's a different, it's a different data source and different age cohorts, but it does tell a somewhat similar story in the sense of, yes, you can see the spikiness there, and that's the seasonality that you would expect, because a lot of times young people are most active in the labor force in the summertime, so those numbers go up. But generally, it follows similar trends. There was a big dip during the Great Recession, and then kind of as we get into quarter 2 and quarter 3 in 2021, which is the most recently available data that we have, you can begin to see the kind of the increase, particularly in that, 14 to 18 age range. And so, in a lot of ways that kind of mirrors what some of the national data were showing us. So now I want to, just switch gears a little bit from kind of some of those trends to think about kind of a different question, and that's, when do young people enter the workforce? Now, a lot of high school students work part-time when they're in high school, but not all high school graduates fully enter the workforce when they're done with school. There are other options that people have in terms of, do they enter post-secondary education? Do they enlist in the military? Do they take that amorphous gap year? So as a result, before we dive into what young people do when they enter the workforce, I want to spend just a bit of time looking at what high school graduates do when they finish, or particularly when they finish high school. And to answer these questions, we're able to get information from, the Missouri Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And for what it's worth, DESE has a lot of great information if you're interested in kind of schools and outcomes and all sorts of different things related to, secondary education. Now, as I said, a good number of students kind of work through high school, at least in the summertime, but really that big choice comes when they leave high school, and there are different paths that can take, such as 4-year, 2-year workforce, military, etc. So what DESE does is they have a 180-day follow-up survey. So basically 6 months after they graduate from high school, we can see what they're doing. And that's what this chart basically shows, is what are the choices they've been making over time for the last 2 decades, like through 2021. And so, what we can see is that the 4-year has stayed relatively, constant kind of over the course of the past 2 decades, between 35 and 40%, although the pandemic certainly had some negative consequences as the share of Missouri high school students dropped below 35% for the first time kind of this century. Now, whether that's the start of a new trend, we'll have to wait and see. Who knows if it was kind of just the economic hardship that goes with, that the pandemic caused, or not wanting to have a virtual higher ed experience, or, who knows what it is. It's kind of 1 year. We'll have to see what happens there. But, and I guess I'm thinking kind of very selfishly as someone in higher ed too, I'll just say as an aside, when you pair this consistency of 35 to 40% going into 4-year education with a shrinking population, it's going to be a problem for us, because us in higher ed, that is, because we're going to have to find students enrollments that come outside of our traditional customer base of 18 to 22-year-olds. In any case, that's long story short, that in Missouri, generally speaking, over the past 2 decades, between 35 and 40% of Missouri high school students entered a 4-year degree. Now, if we think about, and this probably has a little bit more applicability for kind of just entering the workforce more straight away, students choosing to go to a 2-year institution and choosing to just enter the workforce directly to go into employment appear to be a bit more connected to the economy. So when the economy is bad, there are fewer opportunities. So students go to school more so than straight into the workforce, where there's a lot of competition from, the unemployed workers coming back into the workforce. When the economy improves, more people tend to enter the workforce. And in 2021, the share entering the workforce surpassed those going to 2 years for the first time in about 2 decades. And again, some of this, could be the impact of the pandemic on higher ed, but also it just could be the opportunities available kind of in the workforce. We know that there, that the recovery has been kind of from the pandemic has been underway. But anyway, generally speaking, again, community colleges tend to be countercyclical, but overall, about a quarter of all Missouri high school students either go into the workforce or go to a community college. Now, I'm a geographer by training, so not only a data geek, but also kind of a map geek. And so I'm always interested in just the spatial variation of some of these trends. And Missouri's pretty good, generally speaking. We're a pretty representative state because we're a pretty diverse state, generally speaking. So the map on the left just shows the percentage of graduates attending a 4-year institution in 2021. The number of Missouri high school students going to a 4-year was 34%. But when we look at the patterns and how it varies across the state, it's low in the Ozarks, which has some of our more disadvantaged counties. It's higher in some of our more urban, especially suburban counties, often where there are higher levels of overall educational attainment, which again is probably not terribly surprising. You might be interested to know that Gentry County up in Northwest Missouri had the highest percentage of graduates going into a 4-year institution. It was 51%, but that's basically because it's a small numbers issue. So like 28 out of the 55 students that graduated in Gentry County went to a 4-year. And then the other, kind of big areas for 4 years are, as you might expect, Platte, St. Louis, Cape Girardeau, where Southeast Missouri State is, Boone, where I am here today at the University of Missouri, St. Charles County, Nottoway County, where Northwest Missouri State is. Those are the areas that had some of the biggest shares of graduates going to 4 years. Now the 2 years are have a somewhat different pattern, or on the kind of the map on the right, and some of the places with some of the greatest share of students going to community colleges are some of the areas with like strong community colleges. So we can see State Fair Community College kind of pop up. We can see Crowder College and East Central kind of popping up. So that's, a slightly different pattern. Now, probably the thing that grabs your eye, because it certainly grabs mine, is when you look at Northwest Missouri standing out, in part because there's just less access to community colleges in that region. There's also, regionally serving 4-year institutions like Northwest Missouri State. So, the availability or access to these opportunities can really kind of dictate choices. Now, shifting, kind of switching back to the number of students working, which is kind of the main focus of what we're talking about this morning. When you look at like where in the state are the most states just are the most students just straight entering the workforce. It's a bit of a mirror image to the maps that I showed you where students choosing post-secondary education. So, more graduates going directly into the workforce are found in places like the Ozarks and a little bit down toward the Boot Heel. Also, students from non-metro counties were more likely to directly enter the workforce. So, 23% or so of students in kind of metro counties would directly enter the workforce, where almost a third in non-metro were entering the workforce. So again, some of this is it probably, what it does is I'm sure it validates what we probably already knew, but it provides some data to just kind of, again, validate those that intuition. So while this state education data, show the share of graduates going into the workforce, the quarterly workforce indicators, again, this data source I mentioned, can also be a really helpful source to answering kind of the important questions about what kind of work these students actually go into when they do go into the workforce. And again, it's probably another kind of case where it provides data that validates kind of what we probably already suspect. Now, if you look at youth employment by industry, and we can see, and just so there's two pie charts here, just so you know, the pie chart on the left is for students, or for workers. I take that back. Workers age 14 to 18 by sector in Missouri. And then the pie chart on the right shows younger workers age 19 to 21, again, by sector. So these are jobs that we're looking at. And we can see that about half of working people age 14 to 18 work in food service, and another 26% or so, 26%, a little over a quarter, are in retail. So as I said, this validates kind of what we would suspect. And these are not necessarily, career-oriented jobs, although there may be opportunities for careers in those industries, but they're not necessarily career-oriented jobs, but they're important nonetheless. And kind of going back to what I said initially at the beginning of the presentation, that these work experiences are often, important because they, provide a young person's first exposure to the workforce. And as I was mentioning earlier, when we looked at kind of the trends, and we showed that like 40%, following the pandemic nationwide, like 40% of people aged 16 to 19 or so, those jobs disappeared. When you think about it, these are the sectors that were most impacted by the pandemic. And so those employment opportunities for young people were more limited in 2021 into 2020 into 2021. So again, it helps explain that big dip that was there before. Now, if we shift over, looking over the pie chart on the right at, what 19 to 21-year-olds are working in, we can begin to see that shift into more career-oriented jobs. Now, retail remains a quarter of employment, as does food service, but that accommodation and food services number really kind of shrinks in half. And in its place, you begin to see more people going into industries with greater career opportunities, things like healthcare and manufacturing and construction. And these industries provide a lot of different places to enter, with a high school degree or a high school degree and some additional training. And then, within those industries, there are pathways to more middle skill jobs or jobs that can be secured with more experience, or that may require some kind of industry certification or maybe a 2-year degree. So you can see that kind of that change over time, and how you go from just working in kind of the services sector into these different areas once people leave high school. Now, the prominence of young people working in kind of food service and accommodation and retail remains notable. This isn't, I guess the big thing that I just want to kind of make clear is this isn't like it's a new trend. I mean, this has essentially been the trend. These have been the leading sectors employing younger people for a long time. And so the chart that's here shows a 4-quarter rolling average of employment in food service and retail for 14 to 18-year-olds and 19 to 21-year-olds. And again, this is just for Missouri, going back to the beginning, going back to the century 2000. And you can see the overall decline in the number of kind of 14 to 18-year-olds. And those would be the lighter colors on the chart. With the big decline occurring during the Great Recession, and it's still kind of down. You can see in 19 to 21-year-olds, the employment levels held relatively steadier over time, so a little bit less affected in those sectors. Pardon me. And you can also see now that the opportunities have come back in these industries as we emerge from the pandemic. So the purple lines basically show change in food service and accommodation. And you can see that in, here, the light colored for 14 to 18-year-olds, it's kind of ticked back up. That's the recent, there's our recession, and then there's kind of the ticking back up of the recovery. Although we haven't necessarily seen the similar kind of return to food service and accommodation for 19 to 21-year-olds that we have for younger workers. Now, the green lines show employment in retail, and again, steady for 19 to 21-year-olds, but generally down for 14 to 18-year-olds. But again, in the last kind of 8 to 10 months, a big again turn northwards, I guess. So, I think, so to think about what's going on here, I think a lot of this goes back to just the demographic shifts that I mentioned at kind of the beginning of the presentation. And we also, we hear about labor shortages, and we hear about the Great Resignation, which is really more of a kind of a reshuffling of the labor force. And there are fewer people kind of, which is really, there are fewer people in the labor force. And as a result, the kind of demand for labor has increased. Again, going back to, it's harder to find people when there are fewer people to find. And so people, a lot of people who are more fully into the workforce. So 14 to 18-year-olds may be dipping their toe in the workforce, but a lot of 19 to 21-year-olds are fully in the workforce. They're maybe now able to find more stable, better paying jobs, perhaps with better hours than what we might find in the food service sector, for instance. So that probably explains a little bit why they haven't returned to that sector. Well, while we won't know for sure until we have newer data, it doesn't appear that, those 19 to 21-year-olds are returning. And since it's harder for employers in food service to find workers, they maybe need to pay higher wages, and that maybe is likely drawing more younger people into the labor force. So at least that's kind of the hypothesis that I'm kind of working with. But again, there's always new data releases to come, which help, kind of tell us, what's happening with our story here.
Hey, Mark.
Again, yeah.
Got a question.
Sure.
The question is, are we seeing the 19 to 20-year-olds any change in whether or not they're going into the tech sector? Do we have any data in relation to
the numbers?
Sector?
So the numbers on that, these are the two sectors that really just dominate kind of all like employment. And then when you get to some of the other sectors like professional services, for instance, it really doesn't, the numbers are pretty small. So it's not like big trends one way or another. These are what kind of dominate it. Just as a, I think one of I think this will actually bleed into a little bit what I'll show here is that, again, geographer brain. So I got to put things into maps. What the two maps here show is just kind of like a graphic representation or a spatial representation of what those two pie charts are. So the map on the left, again, shows this is the sector that employs the greatest share of 14 to 18-year-olds by county. And again, overwhelmingly food service and accommodation with a few retail in there. Mercer County has agriculture, but again, very small. And then when you move to the map on the right, you begin to see some of those other sectors pop up, whether it's manufacturing, healthcare, even construction in Montgomery County come up. And so I think, one of the things that I guess I would say is like a takeaway from this is, oh, sorry, there's a weird echo there. But much of, much as what we discussed when we saw those maps pertaining to higher education, a lot of what we see here is driven just by opportunity and local opportunity. And so the benefit of local knowledge is that we can look at, like in manufacturing, the counties where there's a big, a lot of students going into, or young people going into 19 to 21-year-olds going into manufacturing. You can see Sullivan County where Smithfield is, and McDowell County where Tyson has a big presence, and Stoddard County where Tyson and Nestle Purina have a big presence, where you can see places like Camden or Taney County where there's opportunities to work in areas tied to the Lake of the Ozarks, or Branson kind of pop up that look a little different. So I guess the big takeaway that I would say here is that the types of opportunity available in local communities can kind of dictate those choices for young people. And so, if you're going to be in an urban area, there's probably going to be a lot more opportunities to go into a lot more diverse types of activities, including kind of technology or professional services. If you're in a more rural area, those opportunities are going to be probably a little bit more limited unless you're willing to be mobile. So, I'm going to wrap up here as we get to kind of toward the end of a little bit of our kind of talking time, and we have time for questions and some discussion. But I want to get to actually, what do we do about this? Because it's, throw a lot of information at you and a lot of trends. But, rather than just talk about these trends, let's think about what we can actually do to help young people get into the workforce. And so, there are a lot of ways to engage young people. So the graphic that I have here is from a November 2020 report from the Brookings Institution, which is about work-based learning. And I think it's a pretty instructive, it's a good little primer, their report, but the chart that's here is pretty instructive in terms of the range of possible actions. So as we think about, when we engage young people about just thinking about careers, at the very basic level, we have career awareness, and that may be career fairs or having employers come into classrooms, and it's not, it's not the most intense activity or long, but it begins to start that process. And then as you move to the right of this graphic, you can see there's career exploration. And so maybe that involves some job shadowing opportunities where you follow someone around for a day. So again, more kind of intensity and duration in terms of the engagement with young folks. And then we have, then you can move into career preparation, which may involve internships or pre-apprenticeships or things of that sort. And then career training, which may be, the most intense, where it's like your registered apprenticeships, for instance. And when you get into those areas, then that's where young people really start to develop connections with people in the workforce. And so this Brookings report covered was they highlighted what are the 6 keys to high quality experiences. And this is the kind of thing that I think as we think, just whether as us as employers, whether it's University of Missouri, or whether it's wherever you're working, or whether if we're working with people in the community who want to engage young people, these are some of the things that we want to keep in mind. And so those things are, connected experiences is one. That means that basically what young people are doing when they're in an internship for something ties to what they're learning in school. So there's a real connection there. They can see why they're learning something in school and how it applies to the workforce. When you have interns or bring people in, you give them meaningful tasks. So they're working on a real project rather than just running errands or making coffee is kind of the stereotypical kind of intern experience, bad intern experience. When it's those adult youth relationships is basically connecting people to networks. And again, maybe it's not something that a field that they're going into, but you're developing a relationship with someone in the workforce who can then write a recommendation for you later. So that's important. There's opportunities for feedback. So that's the time for assessment and reflection, is that there's just, people can think about, give them feedback on how they did, or, what areas they could improve or what more they need to learn. We mentioned supportive services here. One of the things that is hard for a lot of people is having like flexible school schedules or transportation, and trying to find ways to accommodate that is important to make sure that people have access to those opportunities. And the last one I bang the drum over and over and over and over again on is that it's really important that we pay people for their work. So compensate your interns, pay your interns. And a lot of that is also just because the people who can do free internships are the people who can afford to do free internships. So it's really just advantageous for people from to people from poor households to that are missing out on opportunities because they're not being compensated for them. So all of those things are things that we can think about, I think, in our own kind of work lives as we look to engage and bring new people into the workforce, whether through our work or through our our specific firm or enterprise or university, whatever the case may be. So finally, just a few key takeaways, and I'll just kind of race through here, and then we can have some questions and discussion. Those demographic shifts are changing the nature of the workforce and the types of opportunities available. The economic consequences of the pandemic affected the sectors, food service and accommodation, most likely to employ young people. And as those sectors have recovered, we've seen those opportunities kind of come back. There are economic and geographic factors that influence educational and job opportunities. So a lot of it depends on what you have access to locally, can influence your range of choices or affect your range of choices. Youth employment provides valuable life experiences, particularly for, if employers ensure that they're quality work experiences. And because I just threw a lot of data at you, and I realize that you're all probably not data people, but I'm always going to bang the drum for our public data providers who do great work, whether it's through the federal government or federal tax dollars at work through places like the Census Bureau or the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or through our state agencies like Merrick or DESE, because they provide all sorts of information that'll let us actually know what's going on in the world and help us make better choices. So I'm sorry, that's the advocacy is just kind of a macro for the data agencies, is a macro built into my brain. So I apologize. Anyway, those, if you have questions, feel free to contact me. For what it's worth, this presentation came out of a couple of our Missouri Economy Indicators briefs that we release on a semi-regular or fairly regular basis every 3 weeks, a little slower in the summertime. So feel free to subscribe to those. I know that's the most kind of hackneyed way of ending this. Please subscribe to my newsletter, so to speak.